So, among the problems caused by debts, we already talked about debt servicing, where, when you think of crowding out, it seems to make more sense that government services are crowded out by simply paying back past debts. But when people talk about crowding out, what they basically mean at the end of the day is that too much debt can lead to higher interest rates. Higher interest rates being bad for the economy, investment is more expensive, so there'll be less of it, and the economy will stagnate or even decline. And of course, individual borrowers, you want to take out a loan for your home, it's going to be more expensive to do that, so fewer people are able to do that, so it can hurt. Higher interest rates can hurt in a lot of ways, obviously. But how on earth does a higher national debt lead to a higher interest rate? When the government issues new bonds, it's not necessarily going to be charging a higher interest rate. Well, the way this works is that in money markets, there's a supply and demand curve like in any other market. And if the demand curve in any market shifts right, ceteris paribus, the price is going to rise. Well, governments go into money markets in order to get people to buy their bonds. Again, I mentioned mutual funds are among the biggest holders of U.S. debt. But really, anyone who's looking to take out a loan or give a loan is participating in a money market, and government bonds they're oftentimes referred to by economists as the risk-free rate of return, whatever the interest rate is on government debt. As we mentioned, if you loan money to the government, it's going to be paid back with the interest promised. It's about as sure of a bet as any lending opportunity can be. So at any time, if anybody wants to get a return on any loan they make, they can lend money to a homeowner who's going to buy a house with it. They can lend money in the form of a credit card to somebody who just wants to go shopping with money they don't currently have. Or they can lend money to the government. The risk-free rate of return is usually lower than all those other rates because it's so low risk. But that is one option for lending money, and a lot of people are going to gravitate towards the government if the government's doing a lot of borrowing. So this pushes the demand curve to the right and causes interest rates to go up for other kinds of debts. Because if more and more lending dollars are going to the government, in order for other people to be able to take out the loans they need to expand their business or whatever, they're going to need to offer higher interest rates or accept higher interest rates, which again makes investment spending more expensive and slows down the economy. This is how crowding out works in theory. It's generally something, though, that when we're in a recession, nobody's investing anyway. Money markets don't have a lot of activity going on. Interest rates are already depressed. So government borrowing isn't as likely to crowd anything out because it's an empty room full of nobody wanting to invest right now. Everybody kind of waiting for the recession to end before getting back in it and borrowing again. So the government's kind of the only game in town, and there isn't as much crowding out happening. So we're more likely to have this kind of issue come up if you have an economy that's growing and doing well, and there's a lot of investment going on, and high debt levels are starting to push those interest rates up somewhat needlessly. So this is one of the potential problems that comes up. Another problem that we talked about hyperinflation in other countries, and it usually happens as a result of some form, direct or indirect, of debt monetization. The idea of debt monetization is oftentimes put out there in an overly simplistic fashion that essentially says that the government rolls out a brand new, freshly minted dollar bill and then goes and hands it off to somebody they owe money to. It's generally not that simple. There are a lot of ways in which it can be done, but we don't necessarily get into that too much in this class. But do remember M times V equals P times Y, the equation of exchange. If the economy isn't growing, that's the Y part, and remember the V part, velocity of money, doesn't tend to change very much. Well, monetizing the debt means you're printing more M without any Y going up. That's going to cause your price level, the P part of the equation, to go up. And that's where hyperinflation tends to come from. Politicians don't want to raise taxes. Politicians don't want to stop spending money on various government programs. So to pay back debts without having to do it with either of those two mechanisms, debt monetization is attractive for policymakers who generally don't have to deal with the problems of hyperinflation. So the increased attractiveness of this option to policymakers is another thing that has some people worried about rising debt levels, that it'll eventually take us to this place. So another thing you need to know about, it's not necessarily a problem, though it is something that can cause debts to rise naturally during recessions, and in fact does, but it can also cause debts to naturally go down during boom periods. And this is something that is known as an automatic stabilizer. Now, there are a lot of economists who don't think the government should be doing much in the way of countercyclical spending, but there are a lot of economists who do, and a lot of this class has been about that economic idea of spending against wherever the economy is going, whatever the business cycle is. Remember, we call that countercyclical spending and countercyclical taxation. In a recession, spend more, shift that aggregate demand curve out to the right, lower unemployment, bring the economy back to where it needs to be. When the economy is booming, you're looking at some demand pull inflation, cut spending, cut transfers, raise taxes, and shift aggregate demand back to the left. To do all of this, you usually need, from a fiscal policy standpoint, you need new laws passed and executives to sign them into law, and that means politicians bickering with each other. So we need this countercyclical policy to happen, but it's hard to get it to happen from a political standpoint. That's where automatic stabilizers come in. They're features of already existent legislature it's already in there, it's already law, that's going to automatically cause government spending levels to rise when recessions hit and to fall when boom times hit. And taxation levels are going to rise when the economy is booming, but they're going to fall when the economy is in a recession. Well, we need them to. Specifically, progressive income taxes and poverty assistance programs that have eligibility requirements are the most prominent examples of automatic stabilizers, because just the way the whole thing is set up, it's going to cause more tax revenue to come in, more incomes to be taxed at a higher level when the economy is going to do well, because people move into higher tax brackets. When the economy is doing well and incomes rise, progressive taxes mean that taxes go up as incomes rise. So the percentage of most incomes are going to be taxed at a higher rate, and more incomes are going to be higher. So you're going to get more tax revenue when the economy is booming, just as you need to in order to keep inflation down. And when the economy is falling, people's incomes fall. They go into lower tax brackets. So you essentially have cuts to the rates at which people's incomes are taxed as needed during recessions, so that we have less tax money coming into the government and more staying in the private economy in order to help the economy rebound. On the transfer side of things, it's spending from a budgeting standpoint, but remember, these are transfers. More people need poverty assistance. Government is sending more money out into the economy during recessions. But when times get good, people don't need it anymore, and we need the government to pull things back a bit so, again, we don't get runaway inflation. Well, when people aren't eligible for these programs and they don't need them anymore because, thank goodness, their incomes rose, naturally, we don't spend as much on these. So, national debt can be a problem, again, as we've seen in places like Greece and Brazil and Argentina over the last 20 years or so have had some major problems with debt. And in order to handle these things, some propositions have, not to handle them, but to keep them from happening, to sort of immunize a country against having debt problems. I'm going to talk about a couple of common ideas that have come up and why some economists favor them and some don't. Balanced budget amendments are one of them. It's an amendment to a lot of state constitutions actually have these, so they don't have many deficit or debt issues. They can still, under special circumstances, issue bonds, but generally their spending levels are exactly what their tax revenues are. The United States Constitution does not have one of these, but some people say that it should, Because politicians, remember, economics is all about incentives. Politicians don't have incentives to raise taxes when it needs to happen. And politicians don't face incentives to cut spending or transfers that are going to help anybody. So, in short, politicians face incentives that encourage more debt. So we get closer to whatever debt crises might happen if we don't have something to constrain politicians. So balanced budget amendments basically say, by law, you can't spend more than you're taking in. Now, some of the problems that'll come up here, and the reason why a lot of economists don't like the idea of a balanced budget amendment, some do because there may be some costs for slightly more muted economic growth and the ability to attack recessions when they happen, but at least you don't have to worry about the total collapse of debt problems in the future. But economists who don't like balanced budget amendments will first of all point to the fact that you kind of have to plan your spending in advance. You have to plan based on revenues you think you're going to get. The spending you're going to end up doing can be much larger or smaller, and the revenues you're going to get can be much larger and smaller after the fact, sticking you with extra debt levels that now you have to really pull back spending or raise taxes to deal with, and it can be a logistical nightmare to make these work in practice. And then, of course, if you're one of those economists who believes in countercyclical fiscal policy, you can't do it. If you're going to raise spending, you have to raise taxes. And so you're going against what you're trying to do. Another thing that comes up is the idea of rainy day reserves. Usually you're most able to do this with a balanced budget amendment, but if you're doing counter-cyclical fiscal policy the way economists say you should, higher taxes during boom times and lower spending, while you have lower taxes and higher spending during recessions, you might end up with rainy day reserves. And when you have rainy day reserves, when recessions hit, you don't have to go into debt as much because you're just spending down some of your savings in order to attack that recession and bring yourself back to period of growth. And again, there are a lot of economists who will favor this because, first of all, it entails countercyclical spending the way it should happen, higher taxes during boom periods. But there are other economists who think that this just holds our economy back. When we have growth, we want as much growth as we can possibly have. The last time this debate had prominence was around about the year 2000, last time we had a balanced budget and a surplus. That extra money, there was a question of what to do with it. Economists like Paul Krugman said, rainy day reserves, keep it. Because a recession is going to happen, you don't want to go into too much debt. You may know that the George W. Bush administration had several rounds of tax cuts. Some of those tax cuts happened because the economy was in recession and it was a way of getting it out. But at the very, very beginning, before any recession hit, the Bush administration and the Bush campaign, before he was elected president, were talking about cutting taxes because the government had too much money. The idea there, the argument was, that extra money just sitting around in the treasury, it's doing nothing. When you have economic growth, you want that economy growing as much as possible. You want as much benefit to the people in the economy as you can possibly get. So if you lower tax rates, you lower that surplus amount, the opportunity costs of money being holed up in the treasury doing nothing are gone. You have that money in the economy now being spent and invested and spent and invested. And you get that much more economic growth and that much more benefit to everybody. Both balanced budget amendments and rainy day reserves, there's no real easy answer to what kinds of policies to favor. Again, a lot of economists are divided on this issue, but it's important to know what they are and how they work. All right, so with this whole issue, I'm constantly asked about China owning a lot of our debt, and there's an answer to that. But you're going to have to wait for another video in order to